the climate crisis at the local and federal level, with an emphasis on ways students can influence policymakers. Denise Keele received her PhD in environmental policy from SUNY Syracuse and is currently an associate professor of political science, jointly appointed with the Institute of the Environmental and Sustainability at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. Her research and teaching focuses on environmental policy and law, in particular the use of the courts to influence public policy. Since 2014, she has chaired the interdisciplinary Western Michigan University Climate Change Working Group. In 2018, she became the faculty co-chair of WeVote, WMU's non-partisan committee focused on volunteer registration, education, and turnout. Since 2019, she has led the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. She is the winner of the inaugural Climate Champion Award from the Michigan Climate Action Network. All right, Dr. Keele, I think you're ready to go.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me, and thank you, Battle Creek Area Math and Science Center, for hosting the third annual now High School Climate Change Symposium. It is my pleasure to be here. Sorry about that long introduction. Thank you, Sophia, for trying to get all of that out in one fell breath. So these are the groups around my area that I'm involved with. We're on Twitter, social media, websites, of course. Come check us out, and hopefully I'll make some plugs for some of those throughout this, because you too can be making these kinds of organizations right in your community. I hope to talk a little bit about some beliefs and attitudes. You know, why and how do Americans think about climate change, which in my opinion then translates into why and how we don't have good policies right now. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those climate policies, and then what we can do to support climate change policy. And I hope to save some time to just have a good discussion, and we can be pretty informal. Throw those questions in the chat as we go along. And if it's something urgent, I'm happy to get to it. If not, we'll save everything for a discussion at the end. I draw a lot of my scholarship from, there's a group at Yale focused on climate change communications. So there's their website and a few of the reports that I'll be drawing some of the graphs and background information today. And we'll have a moment where we look at some fun polls online. So I always like to start, I think your science talk, if you just were in that session with Dr. Neff, talked about something called the Anthropocene. And really what this means, right, is that we humans are now the geological force most shaping the planet, the human epoch, the Anthropocene. And if you haven't visited Show Your Stripes, which is produced out of the University of Reading in England, it's a temperature gauge, right? Since we've had the 1850 to at least now, since we've had regular weather stations going on. This is the temperature change over time globally, and you can get it for your state. You can even get it for other regions. I always think that good politics needs a good symbol. And so if you shoot me an email after this, you'll see that this is my signature to my email, because we really have to be just everywhere inserting the idea that we are living in an entirely new epoch, and it is shaped by humans. And in my view, that's both the good news and the bad news, right? We know it is us. We know it is human activity that is causing climate change and global warming. The good news part of that is that then we can also be the solution to climate change and global warming. It really is within our power still. So of course, at the global level, I would think that most of you have probably heard of something called the Paris Agreement, signed in 2015. Yes, the US is back in since President Biden was elected. But really what's happening at this global level, how the Paris Agreement works, is each country is supposed to say, hey, here's what I can do. Here's my nationally determined contribution. And then all of those contributions put together are supposed to keep us at no more than 2 degrees Celsius, an aspirational 1.5 degrees Celsius total rise. Of course, we're already at 1.1 degrees rise already. So we don't have much left to go. And unfortunately, if you're looking at this graph, we are not meeting those targets. The United Nations puts out every year since Paris what's called the Emissions Gap Report. So here, this black line would be if we didn't do any policy, right, pre-Paris, we would be at roughly 4 to 8 degree temperature change. Here's our current scenario, depending on how you count it, just sort of look at the blue line. Here's if all the countries do everything that they have submitted thus far, we're right about in here, at least 3 degrees, we think now. Even if we do everything, we say, again, we're shooting for this 2 degree, even 1.5. So we know there is a gap. And you can go to the climateactiontracker.org and you can see actually every different country's commitments and what they're trying to do in country. And there is only, no one is in a role model, only a couple countries, and some of them are in the least developing countries, countries that haven't caused this problem are doing more than countries that have. So we've got a couple countries that would be on track in this green category of actually doing things that we think would meet 1.5. A couple in the yellow, look at what India, Ethiopia, India is way ahead of us, the United States, on actually making climate plans to reach that 2 degree world. The rest of the world is in orange, which means their country's contributions thus far, or even their plan, is insufficient to meeting the targets, highly insufficient. And then I always feel like there's just a whole new category for the United States and for the former Republic of Russia in critically insufficient, meaning we don't have federal climate policy, right? And so the stark ideas here of being able to have countries create the policies necessary, we are not getting there, right? And you all know that this is an urgent issue, that we have about 10 years to make the right policy decisions in order to even have a chance at that 1.5 degree. So what we're gonna do though is think about ways, yes, this is the international stage. We're going to think about some ways to bring that to our local level and to think about how and why we don't yet have the policies that we truly need to combat climate change. So one of the big things when we talk about US policy, why don't we have US climate policy? One of the things that I like to go back to and remember is that really one of the main driving factors is public opinion. Where is the public polling on this? Are folks like you going to come out of school and be voters, climate voters on this particular issue? We politicians really, and elected officials really do have to answer to constituents at some point and think about what they want. And we're at a phase now where I see, and many scholars are talking about how we might be recreating the original environmental movement. Many of you are probably familiar in the 1970s across the world, at least the Western industrialized countries, all really faced a reckoning of the human impacts on the environment. In this country alone, in 1970, in one decade, we passed a Clean Air Act, a Clean Water Act, an Endangered Species Act, toxic substance control, and most of that had to do with a social movement, with activism, with Earth Day. The first Earth Day is 1970. It's no coincidence that we got the first picture back from the moon of Earth in 1969. That really woke people up to say, wow, we're in this together. The Earth is one, but the world is not. It feels like, and I know your keynote this morning, I listened to Mitzi Han talk about her work as an activist. We have an opportunity in this moment right now. It is very similar to the movement of the 1960s and 1970s, that social activism and the concern, the public concern and outcry that brought about that first environmental decade. We could be in one of those moments again. And that will be up to us to make sure that we get the kinds of results that some of our parents and grandparents got 40 and 50 years ago. So I want to take a look at just some public attitudes. And again, I use a lot of the Yale climate opinion maps. And this is a really cool thing. You can kind of go to, it's a nice visualization. I'll try to make that just maybe a little bit bigger. There we go. So you can see. So this is global warming is happening. And in our charts, red is better. So the more red that your box is, the more folks are believing in climate change. So it's happening is at a record high right now. At 72, there we go, I'll make that a little bit bigger for everybody. 72% of the American public now says this is happening. And this is what I mean. We are finally rivaling the public opinion of the 1960s and 70s that put environment on the public agenda to begin with. Climate change is finally there. But if we look at the next question, this is nationally, global warming is caused mostly by human activities. Watch this map. a lot went blue, meaning a lot less folks answer that that is the case. We have a true problem identification disconnect, right? We know now that climate change is happening, but still only 57% of Americans would say that we know that the cause is the burning of fossil fuels is human activities. That is a huge piece that we're going to have to continue to talk about and continue to insert in policy. Otherwise, we're never going to change those outcomes. One cool thing that you can actually do, and you can look at, I know we're in Battle Creek here, I know some of you are from all over, but you can actually look at, Michigan, and you can look at, there's Barry, so there's, if I go down, there's Kalamazoo, there's Calhoun County. You can see how off or on the average you are. So in Calhoun County, Michigan, where Battle Creek is, global warming, you're at even less than that, a little bit less of folks who think that they can make that connection that it's human activities are causing global warming. What about, we know, for example, that it matters if you think the impacts are going to be felt by me, right? We know that that's just true. There's this idea of psychological distance, that if I can see the weather impacts happening, then I'm much more likely to understand and want to do something about climate change. So how about global warming will harm me personally? Wow. In the United States, pretty much no one thinks that they're going to be personally harmed by climate change. We know this is not true. We know we are already experiencing impacts and effects, particularly in our marginalized communities. They are already experiencing massive impacts of flooding, of droughts, of heat waves. This is simply not the case. Yet public opinion is telling our elected officials that, hey, I understand this is happening, but I don't really understand that the source is me, and I sure don't see it as an immediate threat to my world. Those things are the things that need to change in order to get elected officials to understand that this is an urgent issue. So the more we can communicate this, and I was so glad your keynote speaker talked a little bit about that kind of communication, that will be really important. Because when you take a look at one of the other questions, how often do we discuss global warming as people? Let's click on that. Pretty much the whole map goes blue, which is not good for our public opinion. Only 35% of folks, a third of us, would report that we are actively talking about climate change or global warming even once a week. Now, I know that you're the choir and we are here at the symposium, right? This is on average, and these are the kinds of things that need to be in the public discourse way more often if we're truly going to keep and get on the agenda of those elected officials. There are a lot more fun questions. I encourage you, if you haven't seen this source before, to kind of go through and think about which different public attitudes and behaviors then support different policies. And Yale usually updates the survey every couple of years. And so I'm hoping for the latest results to come out. And remember, you can look at your specific county on any of these questions and get a really more accurate view of, okay, how do my residents, how does my congressional district or my school district compare to the national averages, which then can help you have some conversations. So I hope that was a little fun. What you're hopefully seeing from that is that what we really have is an attitude behavior gap. We know that, again, a record like 73% of Americans think global warming is happening. It's like 66% will say they're worried about it, yet we do not perceive this social norm to be taking action. And again, only a third of us would say that we're even talking about it. Much less than that, only about 15% of us say that we're actively participating in a campaign to reduce global warming. Again, listening to Mitzi this morning talk about the activism and how to start your own campaigns and where to start and just start where you are, I could not agree more with her. That is exactly what needs to happen. And one of my main points of advice is that really we just need to be talking about it more with all the people that we interact with, but particularly campaigns directed at elected officials. This attitude behavior gap, right? So let's talk about it. And the first thing, if you're going to talk about climate change, is to know your audience. And this is, again, from Yale and what's going on. This is April 2013, March 2018, and then April of 2020. And they've been asking Americans questions about this, again, since 2013. And what they've come up with is actually 6 global warming Americas, finding who is alarmed, who is concerned, who is cautious, who are the disengaged, who are the doubtful, and who are the dismissive. And so based on the answers to a few questions, the Yale folks say, well, there's actually a continuum here of these 6 different categories. So our dismissives and doubtfuls, at least they're going down. If you look at this is 2013, this is 2018. Here in 2020, we're down to about only 7% of the population that is truly a climate denier, that just says this is not even happening, there's no way. Those folks have really reduced in the population, right? 7%. Bill McKibben, who founded 350.org, came to Western Michigan University, 5 or 6 years ago now. And that was the first time I had ever heard anyone say, well, how am I supposed to talk to these climate deniers? And his response to that question was, I don't anymore. It's this very small percentage of the population. And these are the folks in doubtful and dismissive that you have what's called a boomerang effect. The more you talk to them about climate change, especially about the facts or the science, the more likely they are to dig in their heels and continue to claim you are the conspiracy theorist. And so sometimes, right, if you get into that conversation, you can let it go. On the other hand here, the folks who are alarmed and concerned, like you, like me, we are making up upwards of 54%, right? Look at that change from 16% to 26% are alarmed, even more concerned. These are the folks who, I hope when I'm talking to you, are the folks who need to know, okay, what do we do? How can we make that change? And hopefully giving you some ideas there about how to make that change. Number one is going to be talk about it. The other category, this cautious category, is really interesting. And these are the folks who are like, yeah, it seems like something is going on, but I really don't understand it, or I don't have a good frame of reference for it. The folks in this cautious category also tend to be the folks who are most led by following their peers or social norms, meaning that these are your friends who are kind of waiting for you as climate leaders to let them know, hey, it's really important to me that we consider our waste stream today, or we consider our transportation emissions, or that we think about how our school is getting its energy. They need the alarmed and concerned folks to say and give them those social cues that, hey, this is really something that we should be concerned about. So the good news is these cautious folks, they just don't quite know how you might how they might affect anything, or whether they're kind of on the right side of things, if you will. And so these are folks that you probably know, many of these are your friends, you can then be an influencer of their social norms. So just kind of one thing I like to think about is who are we talking to? And usually once you have a couple conversations with someone, you can kind of put them in one of these categories. But the good news is, right, again, 54% of us are at least concerned or alarmed. If we add the cautious folks, who again, it's not that they don't think it's happening and aren't worried about it, they just quite don't know how to think it through in their social sphere. That means that's how we get our 74% know it's happening. That means that if you're out on the street or in your school or in your community, right, the chances are 7 out of 10 that the person you meet that you're going to start talking to does care about climate change and know it's happening and wants to do something. And I find that, really hopeful to think that if I'm in the grocery store, at any given day, I could at least count on half the people probably being able to talk about climate change with me. And one other thing that I would just add, this idea of then talking about it goes further. And we really have to think about climate change again. I no longer really spend a lot of time thinking about how to answer climate change deniers or to speak with folks. With that level of plurality, upwards of 70% of folks saying, hey, this is something that is happening, and 2/3 being worried about it, that tells me that we're just not quite doing that attitude behavior gap. And what I should be doing is spending my time galvanizing the people who already do believe and understand. And that's why I come to things like this, because you are those exact people. One of the things that, of course, we can do in order to overcome the attitude behavior gap and to really let elected officials know that we care and we're going to be voters on this issue is the protest movements. The politics of protests, I hope, will start to meet the politics of influence and legislation very, very soon. Here's our own climate strike from September of 2019 here in Kalamazoo, of course, Greta, of course, nationally, all over. Again, being able to show the strength of these social movements is what got us environmental laws in the first place. And I think we really are at one of these times. Again, I heard Mitzi talk about the next global strike day is March 25th. Organize, do whatever you can do at your own location and be a part of that movement. I know we'll be doing something here at Western Michigan University. So that concern though, why don't we have policy, Denise? Oh, 70% of people agree. Well, of course, we have what's called a partisan divide in the United States. Not all of that support is equally split between the two-party system. And although we have a huge increase in belief and concern about climate change, and again, those public opinion really matters, that concern is really divided between the two parties of Democrats and Republicans. And knowing that we have a system that is sort of, that is this two-party system, we're essentially tied right now at the federal level, thinking about that contrast is often why we don't currently have climate change policy. So the idea here is if all those 74% people were distributed equally, that would be great. And we probably would have policy, but they're not. The thing that really divides Republicans and Democrats is actually about their value bases. And so one of the other things we can think about when we think about why don't we have policy or how might we communicate it more effectively in order to get policies we want is to think about the underlying value bases. Again, along that 6 Global Warming Americas from the Yale, what they did is then ask a question, are you primarily driven by what's called egalitarianism or individualism? And so here on this bottom graph are the same 6 Americas along those 2 different value bases. And what egalitarianism really means is, this idea of your external factors have a big influence on what I'm able to accomplish in life. This is about systems, systemic change, right? That there is a role for government and government regulation in our lives in order to create those sort of social policies versus sort of an individualistic view. And this is where we often see conservatives and Republicans fall on this worldview that really we need more freedom from government, that we should be relying on the market and economic mechanisms rather than government control in order to achieve objectives. And so one of my reasons for really sharing this with you is I often find that when talking to the cautious, or even if you do wade into a dismissive conversation, you can see most of the doubtful and dismissive folks share a much more individual value base. If we want to move the needle on that side of the aisle, being part of climate change policy, then we need to speak to their values. And that's okay that folks have different views of what's the best way to order society. There are plenty of good, what's called market mechanisms out there to solve climate change as well. And so often we see folks saying, hey, I don't want to believe in climate change because it conflicts with their overall view of just like how the world or government works. And if you are a believer in market mechanisms and you see all the solutions about climate change are these big government things, then you're much more likely to retrench from that. So do think about, what matters to the person that you're talking about and why behind the scenes might climate action be being stopped. So the good news is, I know some of these are a little hard to read. The good news is, though, despite that party, here are conservative Republicans all the way to the most liberal Democrat, what kinds of policies do they support? And again, anything that has to do with market mechanisms, tax rebates, or funding research, or anything that you're going to do to put in cap and trade, for example, or a carbon tax, you usually see Republican support for that. So we really do have to think about the compromising of value bases and how we can achieve climate action that might work for both ends of that spectrum. Where you can see our conservative Republicans fall off on their support for policy is when you start to get into what's called command and control or big government actions, like transitioning the whole US economy, requiring utilities to produce 100% renewable energy. Anything that's going to have like a government mandate is often going to be a rejection of that community just based on that value of how government works. The good news is, and this is by age, is that, of course, you probably have recognized this, there is a difference in your global warming beliefs and attitudes, not just by political party, but also by generation. So these are the kind of classic questions that Yale asks folks. Is it happening? Is it human caused? Most scientists agree. I'm worried about global warming. And over here on the right is, I am a self-identified Democrat, really no change. On the left are our Republicans. And this is by age. So millennials, Gen Z, Gen X, boomers, and what's called the silent generation, the folks right before World War II. You can see there on the Republican side that the younger you are, the more likely you are to support climate action. So there is a movement within even the conservative viewpoint and ideology that this is an issue that has to be faced. Why? Because of course your generation is facing more impacts than mine. This is your future. So no matter party, climate is weeding its way into these value bases. So for example, 42% of millennials who are identified as conservatives would agree that global warming is human caused, whereas only 19% of the oldest Republicans would say that, right? 45% of millennial conservatives say, I'm worried about global warming, versus only 28% of the silent generation. This is going to be a real shift in the Republican Conservative Party. And there will be, again, ways for the Republicans to think about different market mechanisms as good policy that can be shared across the aisle. So I'm very hopeful about some of these trends. Of course, just to talk a little bit about what's going on in the US, it is a climate policy segment here. Of course, since President Biden's election, we do have the infrastructure bill going. A Build Back Better bill is trying to get through Congress. But look at this framing. You know, why does a Democrat talk about prioritizing the economics of clean energy? Because they know that there is a shift in the acceptance of economic policies to combat climate change, especially among young conservatives. This is an attempt at some bipartisan action, even though we're still going to be able to achieve 100% clean energy and try to reach net zero by 2050, right? That is the farthest out you can be, according to the IPCC reports. Several really important people have been put in key positions, and they need us to support these actions, right? You should also know that in Congress, there are, in the House and the Senate at the federal level, there is something called the Climate Solutions Caucus that has been growing since 2014. So even pre-Trump, these kinds of things were happening. What's really interesting is it was started by 2 Republicans from Florida. Why Florida? Why Republicans? Even though there's this divide? Because they saw the impacts happening to their state, right? Miami is at huge risk for sea level rise. So this is 2 bipartisan commissions that are trying to work on these things to give you a little hope. And again, here's this House Select Committee on Climate Crisis. And in my world, right, politics and framing and thinking about how we really would move towards a solution that can get passed, look at this framing. Number 1 is grow our economy and put Americans back to work and clean energy jobs. You have to sometimes be talking about those value bases that maybe aren't your most important, but will get a lot of more folks to mobilize to take the kinds of actions that we need. Of course, you probably are familiar with the Sunrise Movement. So if you're on the liberal Democratic side, this is your premier policy. It has a lot of great things that are being proposed. It would entail a lot of government action, right? Which is why you saw some backlash from conservatives against the Green New Deal. But again, this is our 10-year plan for renewable energy by 2030. It includes that piece of social and economic inequality, which is so important, tackling the climate crisis gives us a real opportunity to not just think about how we manage the environment, but to really think about climate justice. And without that piece, I don't think it will be successful, especially for those that are on the left, on the liberal democratic side. If there's not a way to think about justice in these solutions, then I know many of us aren't going to be supportive, right? Sunrise does a great job of turning what we call public opinion and just the polls into something called salience. And salience means it's so important to me that I will actually hold elected officials accountable on this issue, and I will be a climate voter. And what they do, what Sunrise does really, really well, is organize those kind of campaigns. So if you're looking for a place to work or start, this would be a good organization to check out. They then hold their elected officials accountable by they only support and give their votes to politicians who take a no fossil fuel money pledge. So you're not going to take that money from big oil and big gas in order to get elected, right? You're going to be with us. And they're doing a really, really nice job of blending that public opinion with real action. Again, a true youth movement. If you're over 25, you get to just be, an honorary member. It is really meant to come from your generation. The other kind of policy, just to give you an idea of what a market policy that would have more conservative support would look like, is being promoted by an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which has a great climate voter, right? The same idea. We have to translate public opinion polls into real salient action. And Citizens Climate Lobby is promoting a carbon tax. It's essentially a carbon dividend, though. And so what this would do would be to put a price on carbon where it comes out at the pump, right? And so thinking about the gas line that goes to the factory or to the gas station, there would be a $15 per ton tax. Who's going to pay that? Exxon, Shell, the people who we know are most responsible. Now we're not, economists aren't dumb. And so we know what's going to happen, right? If I give a tax to Exxon or Shell or Mobil for putting this product out, what do you think they're going to do? They're just going to pay it, or they're going to hopefully stop doing fossil fuels, right? Well, they're also going to probably pass that cost on to you and I as we continue to use those fossil fuels. And that might help change behavior. But again, if we're really concerned about justice or equity, we don't want prices just to be raised on average Americans. And so what this does is it takes the money that would be generated from the tax and it gives it back to citizens. So this is in effect in British Columbia, in Canada, for example, and every family of 4 there gets about $120 a month to help them offset any increased costs in energy or transportation that they might be experiencing because of this tax. Again, market policies, this has a lot of more conservative support behind it. Rather than a Green New Deal, I think we need them all. What I'm suggesting is there are really 2 kind of different conversations going on at the political level. And if you can speak to those value bases and your audience, there are some hybrids and some compromises that can be made. Those are 2 organizations that I highly recommend you get involved with, start a chapter. They've got great national support and really great training, either Sunrise or Citizens Climate Lobby. So a little bit about, just bring it down to the state and then local level here. Even in the absence of that international fix, there is no current federal US climate policy. States are taking their own action, right? We're a federalist system, meaning states have lots of powers and we can just do things on our own, especially when our own federal government has yet to really act. And so here we are. Michigan, thankfully, does have a climate action plan, and it's actually getting even better. In Michigan right now, we have, since Governor Whitmer has been in office, she has created the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, was formerly Department of Environmental Quality, to really add this focus on our region of the Great Lakes and on energy. She created an Office of Climate and Justice, which includes an environmental justice advocate and a clean water public advocate. We are a member of Paris. That's what this means, the US Climate Alliance. The great thing about the International Paris Agreement is it doesn't have to just be countries. Anyone can sign on to the Paris Agreement and say, I too am going to limit my emissions so that where my contribution would be helping us achieve that 2 degrees Celsius goal. And Michigan, as well as 20 other states, have said, yeah, we want to be doing that. We have a new Michigan Climate Action Plan. This link will take you right there. Public comment period is open until March 14th, folks. And so it would be fantastic. A quick action you could take would be to click on this link and go ahead and say, I support this plan. Or I think you should go even further, Governor Whitmer. We are currently, this plan would be in line with the federal and international targets of 2050. So the Michigan would try to be carbon neutral by 2050. We've got some really aggressive middle goals there, right? We'd be halfway there by 2030. This plan, again, is a draft right now. It has open public comment for you to have a real chance to tell your state, yes, this is important. I want to see these types of changes along electric vehicles and water infrastructure in my state. Really, really cool action you can take right now. There are tons of other just cities that are doing things, right? And so even if your state isn't doing something, in the state of Michigan here, we've got about 10 cities now that have some sort of climate mayor goal. So meaning a city like Kalamazoo, like Battle Creek, can also sign on to the Paris Agreement and say, I'm gonna limit my emissions and contributions. Many of them have 100% renewable energy goals now. And in just the last couple years, even the last year in particular, we've seen an expanded or increased climate or renewable energy goal in all these cities across the US. And this is because of that change in public opinion and folks like you and I working directly in our communities at the very, very local level. So start where we are. Think global, act local, the original environmental movement saying, here in the Kalamazoo area, you can also do what's called a declaration of climate emergency, the kind of first step to get your community to say, hey, we have a problem here. Those declarations of climate emergency, you can find all sorts of great templates. You could get your school to do one, right? You can find all sorts of templates at the Climate Mobilization and at the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. And I will note to you again, since many of you are right there, Battle Creek has declared a climate emergency as of last April, just 1 year ago. Now they need more help, right? To say, okay, we've recognized the problem. What kinds of policies and actions should we really be doing here in your city? But the city of Battle Creek is on board, folks. You have got them on the agenda. Help them take the next step. And so I've saved hopefully a bunch of time here for some discussion, for some thoughts about this and how you can be part of all of these movements. And my big things are, keep learning. To make sure that you are involved right now just by coming to this symposium, and you have an opportunity to be a true thought leader and a true influencer, I guess, in thinking about how we continue to talk about climate change. Talk about it to your friends, to your family, hopefully even to elected officials. Even if you can't vote yet, you'll be there in a year or two. It doesn't matter. You need to be really thinking about how you can take what you've learned and let's bridge that attitude behavior gap together. These are just some prompts. We can do these if you want. If you want to just have, I'm sure there are probably some questions. If you want to just have some discussion about how to engage in policy. A lot of times I might just start a conversation with someone these days with why I care about climate change, right? I care about climate change because maybe it's because I care about other people. Maybe it's because I care about the livelihoods. Maybe it's because I care about biodiversity. Maybe it's because I care about a future for your children's children. You could think about which value base you went along. I mean, most people, right? Even if we are totally enamored with the Green New Deal, there's a part of us that probably wants to know how much it costs and where that money can come from. And those are okay questions to be able to address. And so think about those different value bases of, am I an individualist? Am I an egalitarian? Where do I fall along those? And where do my friends and family fall? And really, humans actually, we don't like to lose. We love to win things, right? And so any framing that you can do around climate change that talks about the future will be better because you'll all have jobs, you won't be suffering from pollution, you'll be able to still have the lakes and the biodiversity. Anything positive that we can frame it as actually really does help. So I'll kind of leave it. I'll just show you one more. This is the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. Your own, the Calhoun, a couple of Calhoun County organizations are part of us, even though we call ourselves Kalamazoo. And this is the kind of thing that we're building and the kind of thing that you can also start at any grassroots level. Now, after like 2 or 3 years, we're up to a couple thousand folks and about 40 different affiliates of businesses, educations, institutions, regular old nonprofits, you name it, that are all trying to work together to mobilize that change right in our own community. And again, it seems weird sometimes and hard to think about international or even US policy. Think about Battle Creek policy, think about your school's policy and who you could partner with, hopefully across those value bases in order to effectuate change. So I'm gonna stop sharing and see if there are maybe a few questions or things that folks want to have a discussion about in the last bit of our time together today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we have a question. What advice do you have for explaining climate issues to people who are uneducated on the subject?
Yeah, so again, I would go back to, I would ask that person what they care about, what they value. And most of the time, asking some questions of a person first and understanding, oh boy, they're a farmer. Maybe they really care about how they're going to keep their farm going. Maybe they are a kayaker. Maybe they really care about how the water conservation is going. I try to start conversations by asking a question. What's really most important to you? What do you do for fun? What do you care about? What kinds of things are you working on? And then you're the one that has all that knowledge and expertise about climate change, right? You can almost always find something in that person's answer to relate back to climate change. They're a farmer and there's the weather, there's the river, and this is going on. So again, finding out what that person cares about and where they might be on those continuums of value bases or the 6 global warming Americas usually can then give you an entry point to think about, okay, how can I connect what this person already cares about? Can I connect that to climate change? And then that can draw that person in. And instead of, telling them what to think or what to do, draw them in with what they already care about and help them make that connection. And again, you can lead, right? You are the folks who are alarmed and concerned and who know a lot. Just start practicing it. Sometimes if you're out in the world and you're just doing those things, you don't have to make a big deal about it, right? But you can talk about maybe just quickly why you didn't eat meat today or why you rode the bus or on your bike, and then just drop it and just let that sort of be, right? You all know it's a pretty divisive world out there right now, I try not to contribute to that.
Yeah, and we have another question. What does it mean for Battle Creek to declare a climate crisis, or Michigan?
Yeah, good point. So Battle Creek and the state of Michigan have both proclaimed what's called a climate emergency declaration. And what that means, and you can read some of the text of these, what that means is they have taken the first bold step to say, no, the climate crisis is real. It is happening to us right now. We have a very, very short window to address it. And we are going to make this the top of our priority list and the lens through which we see other policies and other government actions happening. And so it's a declaration. It's words, but words do matter. Again, this whole idea of framing the idea and admitting that this is what is happening to us. And then that's something that folks like me and you can then use to hold those folks accountable, right? We should be going back to Battle Creek. It's been almost a year, to your city, and saying, you've said that this is an emergency, that you've recognized we are in a climate crisis. What have we done to take steps to fix that emergency, right? Because I don't know about you, but when I say the word emergency, that means immediate action. That means changing what I'm doing. That's what those declarations are supposed to do, to inspire and to build that kind of political and collective will that then we can take the next step from. But yeah, you can, I'll put some links, or I can share some resources after. You can look up, folks write them all a little bit differently, but essentially it is getting your community to at least recognize the urgent and dire situation that we are in. Yeah, good questions.
Yeah, and then another question, what would you recommend for like a city to do?
Yeah.
That climate crisis.
Absolutely. And so, past saying, okay, this is a problem, we recognize it, we're basically, that's saying we're taking it seriously. The next thing is we should be linking to the Michigan State Climate Action Plan. And every city really does need to start thinking about its own climate action plan. Or your school could be thinking about these things. And really what that means then is, okay, I've recognized that we have a problem, right? And we need to solve it. And so that usually starts with understanding your own greenhouse gas emissions, right? Is it, where is Battle Creek on its buildings emissions? How is transportation contributing? What about agriculture, food? We know, right, what the main sort of sectors are, but usually that involves then a little investigation by your community. Well, how do we compare nationally? And then you can select some targets, right? And say, oh gosh, we have a really big and old housing stock that needs to be weatherized. Or maybe we should be focusing on our city buildings, right? Or how about we think about transportation? And so that's what a climate action plan then does, is it goes sector by sector and really talks through, here are the source of your emissions, and then uses that data to think about what would be then targeted solutions. And again, we've got a really great guide in the state of Michigan's plan now, is walking through agriculture, food, transportation, housing, state, but like all of these different sectors, right? Because sometimes it can get overwhelming, right? Like, here's all these things. They all are connected to climate change. And at some point we do need to, what we're doing now is trying to put those into some sort of context and say, what would be the next best action to take? And so the state of Michigan plan, I would encourage you to look at that and get a lot of ideas that then we can try to also implement at our city and local level to support that plan, right? When Michigan says, oh, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, what that means is Battle Creek, Kalamazoo, Hastings are going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And we're all going to need to find those specific solutions for our towns and our communities. There's lots of good work to be done. We need everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't see any more questions. Let me just look. Yeah. What would you recommend for like young people to do for climate action?
Yeah. I think my advice is very similar to your keynote speakers today. Start somewhere where you are. We know, again, it's, not this individual action, but it's about this collective action. And I guess, my kind of main point to you is at least half, more like 7 out of 10 of the people that you encounter are going to say, yeah, it's happening. They just don't know what to do next. And we can help each other do that together. And just start wherever you are on any small action and get together with other folks. I cannot stress it enough that this should not just be something that you need to go on your own individual crusade. It really is about working with as many other people as you possibly can to take that movement. Maybe some of you are thinking about your dining services, right? I mean, start with your school. Where do we get our food from? How do we get folks to our campus right now? Are there a couple changes that we can think about making as a group? And start there. And those actions then tend to build upon each other and build that kind of positive support. So I would say, form some of your own groups out of these high school symposiums and start some of those actions. And again, there are so many now really great national organizations that are also youth-based. It's too bad, I think Jamie Margolin was supposed to be here in the climate justice section. She runs an organization called 0 Hour. Sunrise is an organization you can look up and start a chapter, right? So you don't have to like have all this stuff in line or have all these resources, borrow from those folks and create then your own local hub of Sunrise. Citizens Climate Lobby trains you, does really effective training on how to do what I'm talking about and talk to elected officials even. You could be organizing in a group to do that. So I would say start where you are, understand your community and find the 7 out of 10 people that are in your class that all want to work on this issue and select the thing you care about the most and start somewhere. And that often helps me get out of any despair as well, right? Like just taking some actions and knowing that we're doing this together helps me with the hopeful end. Yeah.
Yeah, and someone just asked which government official should would be best to go to on a local level.
Yeah. So since your city has already declared a climate emergency, you have like something already kind of on the books, right? And so I would go back to your city commission in Battle Creek and say, "Hey, it's coming up on the 1 year anniversary. You passed this last April. What next action have you taken yet?" Right? Like you can say, "Thank you very much. I see now that you get it. You get it. We are in a climate emergency and we need to act. What actions have we taken? And more than that, what actions can I help you take?" Right? What do we need some help or some thought around one of these different sectors? So if I was in Battle Creek or one of those places that had declared a climate emergency, I would be going back to that city commission and asking them, well, how have they, what's the next action they've taken and how you could help them, right? It's always good to offer your support.
Yeah. What did you do to like get into this field of like teaching about the climate crisis?
Yeah. So, so what I don't know, you all are just so ahead of the game. Like, I don't know that I was really thinking about my life this seriously when I was in high school. But when I first went to college, and this is how long we've been trying to deal with climate change, right? Which is why I can get kind of despairing. One of my first papers in college was on global warming, right? And what we started in the 90s, right? And what we started to know. And so I went to undergraduate science. I have a bachelor's of science in forestry. So I learned how to grow trees, right? And so I have a kind of more of a biological sciences background and ecology centered background. And I really, once I got out and started working with that for a little bit, I really was dismayed by how little science ends up in politics, right? And many of you probably see that out there. I was trained as a scientist, and 2 + 2 = 4, and almost always those kinds of decisions got criticized and weren't being implemented. And it took me a long time, almost this whole lifetime thus far, to really understand the key point I'm trying to impart to you today. It's not about the science anymore, if it ever was. It's about values. It's about what people care about. It's about finding that human connection with other people. And that's really, so about 10 years ago, once I finally realized that, is when I really started just dedicating to the climate change issue and to doing what we're doing here with organizing and speaking to folks and getting that collective action. And so I would say any path that you choose is going to be a path that is going to help address climate change. I don't think everybody has to go to college in order to do this kind of organizing. In fact, it's not even something that I was formally trained in, and we've been figuring it out. And I am happy to help you continue to figure that out in any ways that you want to pursue. And so with climate change, right, it affects, I can't think of anything it doesn't affect. And so I would encourage you all to think about what you care about, what you're good at, do that, and do it through a climate and equity lens, right? Thinking about justice and thinking about climate change. And I think you'll find your way. I really do. Looking back on life, it seems like people made linear decisions, but I think that's almost never true, actually. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming to speak today.
Sure.
It was really inspiring. For our participants, we now have an hour-long lunch, and